Hej och välkomna. Vi beklagar att det tar lite tid med tekniken, men det är nytt för oss alla att göra hybrida event. Så tusen tack till våra tekniskt kunniga personer som hjälper till med det här och kämpar hårt. Jag heter Boel och jag jobbar på Afrikagrupperna. Och jag ska bara prata några minuter och jag kommer gå över till engelska nu eftersom att vi också sänder det här digitalt live till en publik som är öppen då för deltagare från hela världen. So, hi and welcome to this Wednesday evening session. My name is Boel and I work at Afrikagrupperna. We are very happy to host this evening. And this Wednesday session is part of a series of sessions of Wednesday programs leading up to the week 22 in June, where a lot of activities and events are taking place, arranged by the Stockholm Plus 50 network as a response to the UN Environmental Conference, which will be held in the beginning of June in Stockholm. So the network Stockholm Plus 50 arranges a Folkets Forum, a People's Forum. There will be a mass manifestation and lots of other activities taking place during this week. So please join us in Stockholm by then and yes, join us then. Excuse me. This evening, we will start by listening to an international panel discussion, a webinar. Us here in the room, we will see the panel discussion here on screen. And those of you who are with us digitally, just stay put where you are and you will follow the entire evening in the same link where you're at now. The panel discussion will go on until 6:45, maybe a little bit longer due to the delay now in the beginning. Then we will have 15 minutes break. And during that break, we will gather the questions who have been posted in the chat, and I will assist you in the room. If you have questions during the program, please make a mental note or just raise your hand and I will come and collect your question and I will send them to the moderator who will take care of that webinar. And after 15 minutes of break, approximately at 7, we will start the panel discussion again until 19:45. Then we will again have 15 minutes of break, and then we will start the second part of the session, which will be held in Swedish. And that will be led by my colleague Emily, and she will join us here in the room in Hjärtat. So I think I've said what I'm supposed to say, and I am happy to hand over the word to the studio and Emily. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Boel, for the introduction. And most welcome to everyone from me as well. So my name is Emily Mentrakis, and I'm also working at Afrikagrupperna as a policy advisor on natural resources, business, and human rights. And for those of you that are not familiar with Afrikagrupperna, it is a feminist and member-based solidarity organization, and we work with development cooperation in Southern Africa with focus on fair power structures and fair distribution of resources. And besides that, we also support the struggle for free Western Sahara. And Afrikagrupperna is one of many organizations that behind People's Forum that Boel mentioned, and we are hosting this whole evening. So today we will discuss different forms and mechanisms of corporate power, and we will start with this panel discussion. We will soon the panelists will soon get to introduce themselves. So just for everyone to be on the same page, when we talk about corporate capture, then we mean corporate takeover as the phenomenon where corporations use their power and political influence to take control of decision-making and of different institutions, and thus influence according to their interest. Both policy issues, agendas, or even new legislations, and maybe in the long term even juridical systems itself, which in turn then can undermine the realization of human rights and also a healthy environment. And corporate power is also closely related to corporate impunity, which refers to the difficulty of holding corporations accountable when they for violations on the environment and on human rights. And this is what we will discuss further in the second part of this evening, or day for those of you that are in another part of the world. So to discuss all these issues, we have three eminent panelists with us. Yeah, just to clarify also, sorry, if you have any questions, please put them directly in the chat, or raise your hand if you're downstairs, and then we will collect them and answer them after the break. So finally, I will say hi and warm welcome to Danielle, Hector, and Net. And you will now get the chance to introduce yourself. I think you will do that better. So it would be great if you can say your name and also like explain where you're working and with what kind of issues. And then you will have the chance to present the case that you will raise later on. So we'll hand over to Danielle so that you can start. Please, Danielle.
Hello, my name is Daniel Ribeiro. I'm from Justiça Ambiental, a small local NGO in Mozambique. We also represent Friends of the Earth in Mozambique. We work with land rights, community land rights, and fighting against extractives, plantations, and other threats to community land, and of course, climate and these other major issues that everybody's facing. Thank you very much.
And you will talk about false climate solutions today, and then we will come to that. So, Net, would you like to continue?
Hi, good evening here. I'm Net Daniel from the Action Group for Evolution Technology Concentration. I am based in the Philippines. It's midnight here now. Happy to be in this conversation.
Can you double check that your microphone is fine?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I think that we can continue maybe with Hector, and then we can come back to Net when the microphone is working well. So, Hector, would you like to present yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Hector Silva. I am a Salvadoran journalist in Central America, but I am working in Guatemala. I'm speaking to you from Guatemala. I work for Prensa Comunitaria, which is a communitarian and investigative journalistic outlet. We are based in Guatemala City, but we work with a wide network of indigenous communitarian journalists all across the country. Journalists from the 4 Mayan nations that populate Guatemala. And we have been addressing through investigative journalism issues that regarding problems of lands, the violation of human rights by both the extractive industry in Guatemala and the government of Guatemala in collision with those corporations. And recently we have investigating the case of a big Swiss Russian mine in a place called El Estor in northeastern Guatemala. And I will be talking about that case shortly. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Thank you very much, and welcome to you as well. So do we have Net with us?
Yeah, let's try again.
We are trying again, so we'll see if we can hear Net this time. We can't hear you at all at the moment, Net. I think we will continue, and then as soon as it's working, we will come back to you, Net. So let's go to the cases. So the panelists we have with us will present 3 different cases today, and they are all very different and on different levels and scales. But I think this actually contributes or it's very valuable and fruitful because it's a good way of showing the different shapes that corporate capture actually can take, and then we can try to see the different elements of corporate capture in the different cases. Danielle, would you like to start talking about false climate solutions and tell us more about that?
Yeah, so Mozambique is at the moment really investing in fossil fuels. And in North Mozambique, we have gas, Central Mozambique, we have coal. And so we're starting our fossil problems while everybody is talking about phasing out. And these companies have a lot of influence on the decision-making processes of our countries. And so just to give a few examples before I go into the false solutions is that in the north, where the gas has happened, we're starting to have militarization and conflict. And this has resulted in huge social problems and over 800,000 internally displaced communities from this situation. And during one of the big attacks last year, we had 800 soldiers protecting the project, the gas project, and only around 30 to 40 soldiers protecting the civilians. And this shows you how a country's priorities goes to the investment, to the gas, as the protection of the investments is more important than the people, and all the decisions from the corrupt loans and all the rest, it completely captures on the interest of these investments. And when you look at the climate situation, it's very hard for these companies to justify fossil fuels now. And the way basically the only escape door that they have is offsetting, because at this moment, just the 2 gas projects in Mozambique is equivalent to 7 years of France's annual emissions. Why I say France? Because one of the main projects there is run by Total, a French company. So there is no logical way we should be now starting to explore fossil fuels at that scale, given the climate crisis. But the main narrative that Total and Eni is the other big company involved is through offsetting or through claiming that these emissions can be compensated elsewhere. And in Mozambique, they're doing this. Eni, for example, which is the Italian company with one of the concessions, is planning to plant over 8.1 million hectares of plantations of trees in South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Ghana. And so now what's happening is that we have the communities being affected by the gas, not only by losing their land, they're also losing access to the ocean and their livelihoods. But now you have other communities losing their land for compensation and offsetting for these projects. So we have now communities getting, because they are looking at areas for these so-called 8.1 million hectares, and it's all in community land. So we're having now communities getting threatened by both the cause of the problem, which is the fossil fuels, and now what the false solutions. And that's not happening in Mozambique, but it's becoming more and more common, especially since Glasgow, where Article 6, which the carbon markets were approved. That means now there's a whole market to feed into this issue, which is now going to accelerate. And the sad thing is all carbon credits since 2013 can be included, so it's backdated. And countries like Mozambique are highly at risk, because it's common for when we have a global problem to look to the south, to the poor countries, and especially poor countries' lands and indigenous communities and local communities' lands as these false solutions. And we need to be very careful, because Mozambique right now is having conflict, and one of the reasons is we have a lot of young youth losing land, having no livelihoods, having no hope for tomorrow, being disrespected, and that causes a lot of social instability. And that's one of the reasons why we're starting to have insurgents and military conflict up north. And this is going to spread. So, and unfortunately, there's very little. These companies have very little. Most of these standards are voluntary. The last 2-3 decades, we've been focusing on voluntary guidelines, best standards, and these don't have any power. There's no legal power to these. So it becomes very difficult to fight these companies and really stop these injustices. And that's where it leads to the other issue of we need binding laws to control this, and processes like Geneva, the binding treaty against corporate impunity. But we'll talk about that more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle. And yes, we can come back to what's need to be done later on in the session. But thank you for raising all these important issues. And it's actually terrible to think of that the net zero goals that are set everywhere, and that's what we are striving for, that they are actually not really leading to any real change. That basically needs that mean that companies and businesses can continue business as usual then, but besides that, also land grab somewhere else for these tree plantations. We will now move to Guatemala, I think. Hector will take us to El Estor and talk about a nickel mining business there. Please, Hector, tell us more about it.
Yeah, thank you. So I will be presenting the case of El Estor, but just a couple of things that I think are important to be known about Guatemala. Guatemala is the largest country in Central America, and is populated by 60% of its population is from indigenous Mayan descent. And this population has been struggling with the power of the elites in Guatemala for centuries. And one of the scenarios of that fight is the fight against international corporations that perform extractive industries in Guatemala, mostly namely mining industries, hydroelectrical industries, or oil palm industries. The Lestor case refers effectively to a nickel mine, which is based in Switzerland, but is owned by Russian capitals mostly. And this mine settled in Guatemala back in 2011, and has been extracting a lot of nickel that it's eventually sold in Europe and fits the production of steel in European markets. Some of their clients are Swedish, like IKEA, and others, right? But the operation of the mine in Guatemala, in El Estor, which is a small town by the largest lake in Guatemala, there is the mine, the main nickel mining facility of this company, which is called Solway. The way that this mine is operating, they have been harassing for a decade now the local Mayan Kekchi communities. They have been appropriating the lands by illegal means. They have been targeting and profiling community leaders in order to extort them and force them to give land and not opposed to the mine. And they were operating not under the radar, but with the complicity of the Guatemalan government, which that's another important thing to be said. The Guatemalan government, by indexes as Transparency International one, is one of the most corrupt governments in Latin America. It has a lot of problems, and it has a long history of repressing indigenous communities in the country. Well, the mine was supposed to operate just after they had conducted a popular consultation with the Mayan communities there. They never did that, but they still operated. Back in 2019, the Constitutional Court of the country ordered the mine to stop operations. They never did, and with the complicity again of the government, of the executive branch, the judiciary branch, and aside of operating illegally, they were still targeting, profiling, harassing the communities, even by criminal means. So we have been with Prensa Comunitaria covering all that, and recently we engaged in an investigation that put out a lot of internal documentation of the mine that clearly showed how the mine paid public officials in Guatemala from the ministerial level, in the economy ministry or the environmental ministry, to the national civilian police, They paid for the food, the gasoline, the lodging of police officers and members that were summoned to El Estor to repress the population. The government would declare martial laws in El Estor if the mine asks so. And there was all this environment of conflict because the Mayan Quechua communities have a long history also of resisting the government, resisting the military, resisting now the foreign companies. They have had a long history. This El Estor is situated in a mountainous region of Guatemala that was very important during the civil war in the country back in the 80s and 90s of last century. So they have been, even with their scarce resources, confronting these giants, but they haven't been successful because, again, the complicity of the government has been there all the way. And I will finish by kind of pointing out the kind of damage that this company is doing. The whole resistance, the recent resistance from the Mayan Quechua population in El Estor started back in 2017 when local fishermen discovered a huge red stain in the lake. And after discovering that, they started realizing that the fishing was becoming more scarce and more scarce. Because of that, they denounced that. And then repression started. They demonstrated in the streets of El Estor, and back in 2017, a fisherman was killed by the police working for the mine. The government tried to deny that, and instead of investigating that, they went after both the fishermen and the local journalists that were covering the case, and they had been harassing fishermen, indigenous leaders, and journalists, local journalists, at least 4 of them, by accusing them of criminal charges or just seizing their houses back and again since that happened. And in 2022, then the situation escalated again because the indigenous communities resisted and put together a demonstration that didn't allow the mine to bring the coal that they need to operate, and the mine was about to stop. But what they did again is go back to the government and ask the police to intervene, and there was a lot of repression, and the whole cycle started again. So this is pretty much the case. I'm happy to take questions or talk more about what I think could talk better about, which is that collusion that happens in Latin America between foreign corporations that do all this environmental damage and take over the economies. The collusion that these foreign
Hector, I think that we can come back to that in a moment. Great. We should let Net present her case as well, and we will talk further about that soon. Thank you very much for your presentation. And yeah, it's very awful to hear the situation, how it is there. And I think there are also several similarities from the situation in northern Mozambique that Danielle talked about. But yeah, I would like to hand over to Net that is going to talk about corporate capture in the food system in general. So I think that you will talk in a different level, and we will see how corporate capture can be seen in that different perspective that we can discuss after your presentation as well. So please, Net, go on and tell us about.
I hope you can hear me now, Emily. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, that's great. I had to change my headset.
Yeah, so please also start with presenting yourself.
That's right. Thank you. I'm Nat Daniel. I work with the Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration, etc. group. We are a small civil society organization that's been tracking new and emerging technologies as well as governance of food and agriculture. For the past 40 years, we've been tracking corporate consolidation, corporate concentration in global food and agriculture systems. I am based in the Philippines. We have an office in Southern Philippines, also in Mexico City, in Quebec, Canada, and in the UK. So as Emily introduced, I will be talking about corporate capture of the global food systems. I will start with the premise that corporate capture in the global food systems is anchored on the reality that industrial food and agriculture systems is in the palm of big corporations. Like if you look at the seeds and agrochemical industries, like in a research that we're coming out, updated research that we're coming out in the next few weeks, um, we are going to present that about 60%, 58% actually, of the total seeds market globally is actually controlled and concentrated in the hands of six big corporations. That's namely Syngenta, which is owned by ChemChina. That's Bayer, which bought up Monsanto in 2018. You have Corteva Agrisciences, which was the merger of Dow and DuPont. And you have Bayer and also another German company, KSW. So about 60% are actually in the hands of six huge corporations that are dominating the seeds industry globally. And you will see this same corporation, five of those six, also dominates the agrochemical industry. The agrochemical industry is much bigger, and yet about 77.8% of the total global sales in agrochemicals, that includes pesticides, herbicides, weedicides, are also in the hands of six corporations. The same names that I mentioned earlier, those six big companies, and it's the same story. If you look at synthetic fertilizers and also the big machineries, different companies, but also the same story as in four or six handful companies dominating a whole industry globally. And this kind of consolidation and concentration is actually getting worse over the decades, especially now with digitalization in agriculture as the dominating technology that is cutting across the different sectors in the whole food and agriculture industry. So this is the context. When you talk of corporate capture in food and agriculture, it's a very important context to take into account, that corporate capture actually becomes smoother if the industry is actually in the hands of a few corporations that dominate that particular industry, not just sector. And in the case of food and agriculture, you're talking from seeds all the way to commodity trading. And in the report that we're coming out in the next few weeks, we will show that across the industry, from inputs that include seeds, agrochemicals, that I mentioned, and synthetic fertilizers, big machineries, animal pharma, livestock genetics, all the way down to commodities trading, are actually in the hands of a handful of global transnational corporations. And it's a very important context to be able to understand how corporate capture in food and agriculture systems happen at the global level. And a very concrete example to show corporate capture in food and agriculture systems is what happened last year in the UN Food System Summit. And we all know, those of us who have engaged at the policy level, at the global level on food and agriculture, that many big networks, civil society networks, also farmers, alliances, including Via Campesina, have actually boycotted the UN Food System Summits for the same clear reason, that the whole process that actually led to the summit, the organizing of the summit, the planning of the summit, the execution of it, was actually dominated by corporations. Like even the envoy that was appointed by the UN Secretary General to lead the summit actually came from AGRA, the Alliance of Green Revolution in Africa, which we all know is actually heavily funded, actually established by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Africa. There's been tons of studies that show the very connect between AGRA and Gates Foundation. And we at ETC also came out with a very clear critique and analysis and interrogation of the players behind the UN Food System Summit, starting from the big names such as the lady, the director from AGRA who became special envoy, the people who made up the planning committee, the decision makers actually have links, very concrete links with big corporations, and have been known to have represented corporations in big fora like the World Economic Forum, also those alliances of industries around food and agriculture. And if you look closely into the discussions, also the submissions on game-changing propositions that were actually at the heart of the discussion of the Food System Summit, most of these propositions also came from corporate names, big corporate names in food and agriculture. Some of them could be quite ironic, like the American Soybean Association, for example, submitting as a game-changing proposition the production of the sustainable production of soybean, when we all know that the American Soybean Association, for example, has been pushing for the deployment and also normalization of genetically modified soya globally. You also have big names like Tyson Food, which is the biggest name in processing of animal meat and packing, proposing such ridiculous game-changing solutions as sustainable, environment-friendly production of and packing of animal meat. So it's actually those who are responsible for the unsustainability, the unenvironment-friendly profile of the food and agriculture, the fractured system that is the food and agriculture system at the global level, that are actually proposing ways to make it sustainable. So that's a clear example at the global level that corporations have actually captured a UN system process that is supposed to discuss and propose solutions to address and fix the broken food system. And it's not just about an issue of losing credibility, but also coming out with very questionable content and proposals that cast a big shadow in the UN system as a whole. So just to put that as a case, and I would really want to go deeper into the discussions as we go into this exchange.
Thank you very much, Net. And I think the numbers you shared with us regarding the food system, and they are really very, very, very strong. And it's very clear how they actually control the whole chain. As you said, like 60% of the seeds, and then also almost the same in the agrochemicals that these seeds actually need. So it's very clear how they're taking over the whole food system. And I also think it was very interesting that you raised how the Food Summit has been taken over by the corporations. And I think that it's not only from at the Food Summit, we saw similar problems also at the latest climate conference, for example, where the climate lobbyists were highly represented and also influencing the agenda there. So I think that could also lead into corporate aspects in the climate issue. But before continuing on that, I would also like to add, because the case that Net presented, or the study that Net presented, really speaks by itself, and it's very clear the corporate capture aspect. So I just want to also add that there are different elements in corporate capture, and that can also help us to actually see that this is part of the same the same system and of the takeover. So, for example, there is one element is community manipulation, and I think that Hector was a little bit into, like how corporations give false promises to be able to start their businesses in a certain area, and not proper consultation on informed grounds and so on. Another element is the judicial interference, that I think also was very, very clear in the Elstore case, or that you can elaborate more on. How the court and system is bridged by corporations, and also the privatizing public security services, like taking over, like but the police and armed services, for example. And also, to mention another one, also shaping narratives is also a form of corporate capture, that corporations influence the public opinion. So we will talk more about all these issues, but I think that it's time for a break. So I suggest that we take a short break and then come back and continue discussing these aspects, and we will collect the questions during the break, and we will incorporate the questions and answers after the break as well. Hi, and welcome back. And thank you also to the audience for all the questions that you have been submitting during this break and before that as well. I think that we can continue, since we didn't have time before the break, to talk more about the corporate capture aspect. And so we continue with the program, and then we will incorporate some of the questions and then add some questions that will not be answered in the end. Hi, and welcome back. And thank you also to the audience for all the questions. I think that it works fine now. So I suggest that we continue. And before the break, we got a presentation from the different cases that Danielle, Hector, and Annette presented. And now it would be great if you could elaborate a little bit more on the corporate capture aspect of them, both of your own, but it would also be nice if you can reflect on each other's and maybe see similarities and interesting aspects that your fellow panelists have raised. Danielle, would you like to start?
Yes, so one thing I noticed is there's a lot of commonalities. The companies around the world function in a very similar way. When a colleague from Guatemala, Hector mentioned the oppression of the communities. In the case of Mozambique, we had a local community journalist being basically, he's been missing for 2 years now, and he was taken by the military. One of the community leaders, after raising issues of military abuse of the communities, also at midnight, military came and he's been missing for 1.5 years. A colleague of ours, which we work with, also highlighted some irregularities in the elections. He was assassinated by the police. So this oppression and human rights violations by the government to protect corporate interests is common throughout. The other thing is the company's takeover of police, military, and using state structures to oppress and protect its services. I mentioned that there were over 800 soldiers protecting the Total investment and very few protecting the civilians during these insurgents attacks. But also there was a scandal where $80 million were given by Total to the Minister of Defense, but this money didn't go into the state. It went into unknown private accounts. So you also see this corruption and a few other cases. And another thing that's common that also popped up with our other representatives is the decision-making processes, in which, in the case of Mozambique, a lot of the decisions aren't for the interest of the people, but for the investors. And we're having this happening at a global level, as mentioned. We have the UN and these spaces that are supposed to be these democratic spaces to represent people being captured by the corporations. If you look at the government delegations, they have a lot of corporate individuals within those. Also, you see the lobbying and all that. So these are very common at a global level, national level, and elsewhere. In the case of Mozambique in specific, you notice the links, the individuals, the rotating doors in which you see individuals in the private sectors as investors in these projects, but also as decision makers within the government. So this is something that's become more and more common. And we don't have, it's very hard to fight against this. We have very few legal tools to deal with it. And the problem is, even when you get, the first thing is getting things on paper, getting laws and regulations that are binding. The next step is making them work. So in the case of the gas projects, for example, we had the land acquisition was illegal. When this was exposed by the Lawyers Association of Mozambique, they backtracked and corrected it, but this highlights these problems. So, and in court cases, like even when you win court cases, we've had victories in court around the coal, and the companies just refuse to not. So even when the courts state that something has to be done, the companies just don't do it, and there's nothing we can do. And the court's orders are ignored, and they carry on doing what they carry on ignoring it and doing what they want. It tells you the power they have. And a good example was during COVID in Mozambique. The minute COVID started occurring, the government put a 2-week quarantine anyone coming from outside Mozambique. The only group that was not doing this was the Total workers. So Total workers were coming from France to Mozambique, and the first cases of COVID was in the gas area. And at one time, more than half the cases of Mozambique were around the gas projects. And that shows you that it's not only, there's an impunity. They can function above the laws, and the companies, they have, in the case of Mozambique, we're one of the 10 poorest countries in the world, and the GDPs of these countries exceed our GDPs. They have, and this economic power and influence is huge, to the point where the company functions for the government functions for the interest of these companies.
Thank you, Danielle. It's very interesting. I'm also wondering if you would like to comment, or like what's your take on, do you think that I mean, the whole narrative when it comes to the climate and what the climate crisis and what we have to do about it, I mean, we see not only businesses but also like governments putting up goals of net zero emissions at certain years, and also like the climate negotiations are also like negotiating for reaching that type of goal, which might not be that sustainable then. Do you think that this also is a narrative that is started by corporations, since it might be a way for them to continue their businesses, or what's your view on that?
I definitely think if you want to understand an initiative and whose interest these initiatives are for, look at who supports it. In the case of net zero, you got Shell, BP, British Airways, Amazon. It's a lot of oil airlines. It tells you why would they be interested in something if it's very clear. For us to deal with the climate crisis, we need to have we need to stop using fossil fuels. And for them to be so interested in these approaches, it's because it allows them to continue to do business as usual, and that's the fundamental aspect of this. There's a lot of studies showing that Europe could reach net zero and the global emissions can go up. and there's models that can, there's a lot of examples of how Europe, the whole of Europe, could reach net zero or carbon neutral, but we can have global increase in emissions. And that tells you that there's a fundamental problem if you can get a whole region like Europe with net zero or carbon zero and still have a global increase. That tells you that there's a fundamental flaw in this approach. And the problem is, for me, one of my fundamental problems is that in crisis, people get desperate. And governments and corporates are very good at taking advantage of crisis, the shock doctrine, and this ability to, the urgency causing the corporates to put in these false solutions, because something has to be shown. People are desperate for solutions, and something has to be shown for these solutions. And this is when these kind of problems occur. And we have right now the market solution, which is the Article 6 was approved in Glasgow, which is the invisible hand of the market controlling an invisible gas, that it's a perfect structure to continue doing business as usual. And we can't hide away from one fundamental fact, is that we need to decrease our emissions in our fossil fuels. And right now, we are emitting way too much. And any initiative that allows the continuation of new fossil fuel projects like Mozambique, this is a new project that will be, if explored, will be equivalent to 7 years of a European developed country like France. It shows you that we have no chances of dealing with a climate crisis if we carry on this way. And the other thing we have to also realize is emissions are based on source. So in this case, when a lot of people focus on China's emissions, but if we actually allocate the consumption, like if you have a phone, the phone is produced in China. China is paying for those emissions, but the product is being used by another person in another country. And in the case of Europe, Europe is very good. It's being very successful in transferring its actual role in terms of a lot of the emissions that are produced elsewhere are due to European needs, consumptions, and use of those products, but it's not being allocated. Finland, for example, has a very ambitious carbon neutral, but what they're doing is transferring all its a lot of its dirty production to other countries, but continuing to use the same product. Like instead of burning the gas internally at a national level, you burn the gas in another country, and then just use electricity, which is carbon neutral. And the same is with hydrogen and other technologies. So, and the thing is so that's one area. The other fundamental area is we're confusing the natural carbon cycle with the geological carbon cycle, and the science is very unclear, and we don't have the evidence that shows that trees and this projection of planting these trees and these trees compensating for the fossils. But also what's worse is climate change is going to increase forest fires. So even if we put a solution like plantations for the carbon component to it, we are forgetting that this is a high risk strategy, because we're having a huge amount of forest fires and huge burning of these forests, and plantations are even more prone to this. So we can have all these emissions suddenly go back into the atmosphere very quickly. So it's very scary, because the thing at the end of the day is we cannot hide away from the truth. That is, we need to move away from fossils, and the only thing preventing is political will, because the technology exists, the finance exists. There was a study by Friends of the Earth that showed that the wealth within the 52 richest people in the world is enough to give the whole of Africa clean alternative energy. And Africa has the highest amount of people without electricity. Mozambique, only 30 to 40% have access to electricity. So it's all about political will and decision making. And the problem is our leaders are listening to the corporate interests only.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we can continue, and I think Daniel, you also covered very well different kind of solutions, and so I will ask also the next panelist to do that directly now. Hector, would you like to elaborate a little bit more on the corporate capture of the situation in El Store, but also like reflect on what the other panelists have shared? I think you talked already about how the state forces have acted, and also the public prosecutor and so on. But it would be great if you could elaborate and also relate to the other cases.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, actually, just a couple of things on the corporate takeover in these countries in Latin America, and especially of Central America. This has been happening for centuries now. Guatemala is a great example of that. How the international corporations, mainly in previous years from the United States, have taken in a sort of neo-colonialization of the countries through or with the complicity of the national states. If you're not familiar with it, the United Fruit Company was capable of shaping internal politics and economic policy in Guatemala all of last century, or well, good deal of last century. So what we're seeing in El Estor is a new chapter of that, of corporations taking over through the influence in the internal political scene. And this happens with the acquiescence of both the political elites and also the economic elites. The way these corporations operate, these extractive businesses operates, is that they take over the practical power by dealing and having as partners the great political and economic powers. A way to disrupt that is, of course, changing narratives, as Daniel has been talking about, and this happens in two levels. First, and this is part of the corporations takeover, the way they handle and manipulate the narrative in the international level. In a sort of way of whitewashing the face of international corporations through its influence in the multilateral system as the United Nations. And here is one thing is very important, addressing also what Daniel said, is how a lot of what's happening in these countries at the base level of destructive corporations in these countries has to do with fulfilling European needs. In the case of El Estor, most of the nickel goes to European markets to fulfill the consumption needs of nickel or steel in countries such as Sweden, Switzerland, and others, right? So at the lobby level, in the international level, the narrative is we are addressing as countries all the problems that have to do with this. But at the local level, what's happening is these countries kind of turn their faces away of what's happening at the local level in the communities. So that's part of the corporation takeover, controlling that narrative at the international level. But there have been examples of how the effort of the same communities have gone all the way through the international level, especially through strategic legal litigation, and bringing cases of very bad violations of human rights to international courts. So you have the cases of indigenous Mayan communities in Canadian courts, for instance, of a Mayan Quechua woman claiming that the mine, the local workers of the mine, with the acquiescence of the international holding of the mine, have violated human rights. So that's a way to disrupt that narrative. And of course, the other way of controlling is what we have already talked about, which is having the power, the lobbying power of controlling the state. I will finish by saying this. In El Estor, for instance, while we were reporting there, we addressed one of the local operators of the mine, and he said this, which was pretty clarifying and showing, and said, "Don't make a mistake. There's no state here. We are the state," right? Which tells a lot on how this is happening. And how this shows is, as I said, the police, the courts, they are capable of controlling that in order to guarantee their operation by harassing and oppressing the local communities.
Thank you, Hector. And talking about the narrative that you mentioned, how corporations are shaping that, we got an comment from the audience regarding agribusinesses as well. I think that it's interlinked somehow. This person wanted to highlight also the environmental aspects of agribusinesses with a high amount of inputs and agrochemicals, but also like how water resources are used and so on compared to small scale. I guess it's also a narrative from the businesses, agribusinesses, that the products they are developing are actually leading to development and taking people out of poverty. So I would like with that to switch over to Ned, if you would like to comment on that comment that we received, and also and also if you would like to develop both the corporate capture aspects, but also already now talk about what we can do about it. And it was a question specifically regarding what you presented, how people can what people can do against the control over the food system. So please, Matt.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to go into later into the discussion of how do we as people address those challenges. But before that, it's very important, to identify how corporate capture is manifesting, because like think by understanding the how, we would be able to crunch it in a way that we could come up with practical ways on how to address them, like building on what um, our my fellow panelists said. And I think it's very important that in this battle of narratives, like the misappropriation of concepts and terms and languages that we are very familiar with, like ecological, sustainable, environment friendly, climate friendly, even agroecology, have been misappropriated, no? And sad to say, like even being used in a big way by the very same actors, corporate actors that are behind everything that we're fighting against. Like hearing, like in the UN Food System Summit, for example, I mentioned earlier, American Soybean Association using the word boosting nature positive production in US soybean industry, Tyson Foods saying sustainable beef initiatives. So it's really, yes, a battle for a narrative, but it also starts with the misappropriation of terms that are mainstream, that have been mainstreamed and accepted, and also misappropriating terms that we as civil society, as peoples, have known to have put a stake on in terms of defining what that is. I think we have to be very careful about that, no? And what the my fellow panelists said earlier, I think in terms of processes, we really have to be conscious that there's a massive effort, especially at the global level, towards multi-stakeholderism. Now, this is very important, especially as we go into Stockholm Plus 50, which, by the way, the Stockholm Plus 50 process will actually take off from the same process that was used by the UN Food System Summit, which actually opens up the doors for everyone to come in, everyone to bring in solutions, and we will discuss it in a series of leaders dialogues. No, but then having that kind of approach may look cool, no, for many, but it doesn't actually interrogate that different stakeholders are coming from different contexts, and also the fact that there's a very deep imbalance that needs to be addressed by the UN in UN processes. And multi-stakeholderism is being presented as a process to let everyone in and be part of the decision making, of policy making, without recognizing and acknowledging and addressing the power imbalances that brought us to this problem. think we have to interrogate that process as well as we go into Stockholm plus 50. And this is very important in the discussion of corporate capture, because like corporate capture does not fall from the sky and swamp all of us like very openly. Like in many cases, as we have seen in examples that the panel has given, it actually ranged from the very blatant like use of violence, use of military or police power, to the most subtle, like UN, using the UN as an arena to bring in different stakeholders, and before you know it, oh my God, it's all, the narrative is all in the hands of corporations, and you have all these big players hiding behind the skirt of the UN or the pants of the UN and calling themselves UN bureaucrat, but are actually representing business and industry interests. We've seen that in many UN processes. The most recent, I would say, was the Food System Summit. We've seen that in Glasgow, and probably see it in Stockholm plus 50 in many ways. The subtle ways of bringing this is very important to understand. And I think my fellow panelists also talked a lot no, about how corporate capture actually reshapes global policies without being very explicit about this, like all these discussions about net zero, about nature positive, about nature based solutions. Like if you look at the players that are pushing for them, they're actually coming from business and industry. Like what's their interest on this? And like when you explain by a colleague no from the experience in Mozambique, no, like net zero is not zero, but all these discussions about these hoopla, coalitions, multi-stakeholder alliances around these new terms, that actually brings us very subtly towards a direction that we may not be very conscious about. So you have to be very conscious of these trends, very subtle movements, so we can address them, no, rather than just go into motherhood statements on addressing the problems. I think also another thing that we have to be very conscious about is how innovation is being described and redefined globally and also at the national level. So when they talk of innovation now, it's really very worrying that traditional knowledge systems, local knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems are out of the table. Like innovations has become an exclusive hub of the formal and institutional science, also by corporate players. I think we really have to recognize that and stop that at its track and assert about the broad and diverse sources of knowledge that needs to be at the center of innovation. And lastly, we talk about revolving doors, which is key in many examples of corporate capture. But we have to be also conscious that there are also double doors and mirrors that exist there. Like the example of Agnes Kalibata heading the UN Food System Summit is an example of a mirror. No, like she did not even hide. She did not even resign as director, executive director of Agra. She was at the same time the special envoy on UN Food System Summit, like wearing that hat, a UN bureaucrat and also a corporate person, no, being present in the fertilizer association and all sorts of business and industry sectors. So all of these are actually intermeshed when we talk of the evolution and the evolving phases of corporate capture. And I think w- let's put that on the table and we address, no, like what how do we um address that as people. Of course, exposing is one, like letting everyone know what's going on is key, because this could actually be very blinding and also confusing for many of us in civil society who are really well meaning, who actually often get distracted by the language and misappropriation of the terms. We actually associate ourselves with those terms without realizing that those terms have been misappropriated and redefined in a totally different way, and sometimes in a opposite to where we wanted to bring it. So I think we have to really expose these trends, also challenge these trends openly, and be warned, no, that there are processes like this, and we have to be very conscious of what we are getting into, especially since the UN has become a willing player into this, has actually even changed the rules in many ways. Like the multi-stakeholder approach has actually become a landmine that many civil society and social movements that are going into global policy processes have to really navigate. So I'd like to stop there.
Thanks a lot, Nate. And I think that you showed in a very nice way also how these different expressions of corporate power that could look as very different things, that they all actually lead to corporate capture in the end. So we have a couple of questions from the audience that I think have not been answered yet. Some have been covered in your replies, but I will go through them, and it would be great if you could answer quite short, since we have just 15 minutes left on the whole session. The first question was directed to Hector, and it is about the Russian connection to the mine. This participant is wondering how the war in Ukraine is, what impact that has in Elstor at the moment.
Actually, it hasn't had quite a lot of impact in local terms but it has had an impact for the company, for the mine, because one of the largest markets that the Russian company was exporting to from Guatemala was the Ukraine. So in that regard, it has had an impact, but not in the local level. At the political level, locally in Guatemala, the president of Guatemala, Alejandro Yamatei, has tried to use this politically by, again, controlling the narrative of putting this whitewashing narrative around by making, all this show about how he welcomed to Guatemala a number of Ukrainian families that were actually the families of some Ukrainian workers of the mine, and they didn't even live in Ukraine when this happened. So in general terms, the impact has been felt by the mine at the commercial international level. Emily.
Russia, does that not impact the activities of the mine?
Sorry, I lost you at the beginning, Emily.
Yes, sorry. Thanks a lot for your answer. I was wondering, I think that it was also part of the question, if the sanctions, economical sanctions towards Russia, does that have any impact or implication for the mine?
Not really, and this is another interesting part of how the corporations manage to control everything from different places, because legally the mine, nonetheless owned by Russian capitals, is established in Switzerland. So for all legal purposes, the legal base of the mine is in Switzerland. So the Russian sanctions don't affect the mine in that regard. It's just, again, at the market level, not at the political sanction level.
Thank you. And I think that's also a very interesting point, and something that's common for all where we see corporate violations. That the problem is that the corporations, the structures of them are so complex, so it's very hard to actually keep them accountable for the violations they are causing, since you don't really know who is the responsible for it. I think that the question regarding Russia was also very interesting, and I think there also there might also be links to the other cases. I get a bit interested of the since the sanctions and the world's reaction of not being dependent on fossil fuels from Russia. I wonder, Danielle, does that have any impact? The Russia finding fossil fuels elsewhere, does that have any impact in Mozambique and in the projects with liquid natural gas that you were talking about?
It does in a way. So Total actually had called a force majeure, meaning that they stopped all activities on the ground due to the conflict. There was the last year, 24th of March, was a big attack on the town near the project, and Total left, stating that they will return to operations once the governments can guarantee security. But suddenly, with the situation, they're back on the ground. They want to restart activities, and we still have the conflict. There's still attacks. There's still insurgents. So you can see that sudden change because there's opportunities now. Because now there's Europe is looking for diversifying where it gets its gas from. And you also see it in the UK, because one of the big funders for the gas projects is the UK Export Finance, Exim, and they financing $1 billion for this project. And they had the project was approved just before UK had made a decision to no longer fund new gas and coal. But now they reverted that decision, which means it shows the reason is for energy security and less dependency on Russia. So you're seeing a lot of these decisions, and now there's a lot of interest in Mozambique gas, because at one time due to the human rights issues, due to the environmental impacts, it's in a UN biosphere of global importance. It's a recognized UN biosphere, and the conflict, the high risks, there was still a lot. The project still was requiring power purchase agreements and other important components for it to move forward. And now these things are starting to move forward. And part of the reason is Europe's interest in decreasing dependency on Russia. So yes, there has an impact. It's still early, and we're still doing research on more how it's actually impacting, but the early science says yes, because it's not only the conflict, is Europeans focus on diversifying and getting gas and other resources from other areas. So it has impacted.
Thank you. And I think it's important to keep that in mind also when in the discussions about the dependence from Russian gas and coal that importing from elsewhere also has a negative impact, that we need to choose another way rather than just replacing fossil fuel resources. I don't know if Net would like to say something shortly also about the impact of this of the war and the sanctions and so on also. And I mean, also Ukraine is an important country when it comes to cereals and wheat. And does that have any implications?
And fertilizers, of course.
Mm-hmm. Please go ahead, Net.
Impact, which is seldom because like Russia and the Ukraine together actually supplies one third of the world's total supply of wheat and barley. And there's even statistics that about 15% of the world's requirements for carbohydrates actually come from those two countries. And that situation is exacerbated by the fact that both countries are actually key suppliers, in particular Russia, of synthetic fertilizers. I think that would really have long-term bearing on agriculture, on food prices. We're already feeling that strain. And like if I just have to mention, for example, Russia is one of the 4 countries which is the source of 80% of the world's commercial potash, which is a key fertilizer, potassium fertilizer. So that's how important is Russia in world agriculture. It's where of course much of the talk is about the impact on energy supply of oil and gas, but of course um, often not discussed openly is the impact on agriculture, particularly because of the supplies of fertilizer, not to mention the grains that I did mention. Of course, a lot of countries, particularly big industrial agriculture countries like Brazil, for example, are already feeling the pinch of the sanctions, and there are, of course, it's a no-brainer that a lot of these considerations are actually material in the political pronouncements and even votes made by countries like Brazil, India, China, and big agricultural producers that have been registered in the UN. So I think we have to really put this forward. When we talk of corporate capture, we also have to talk about political capture because of all these realities that actually could spell doom in global food futures.
Thank you, Nat. There was also a question that I think that you would be answering very well about if you could elaborate a little bit how democratic processes are influenced by corporations, also elections, for example. Is there any connection like that? And also like how governments in general are influenced by corporations. If you can give a very, very short answer to that.
In many ways, some direct and some very subtle, especially in the era that we live in now, that in the digital era that we are trapped in. Like this question is very relevant, and the answers are quite obvious, like how social media such as Facebook, for example, and Twitter, especially now taken over by the world's wealthiest man, Elon Musk, who bought it for $44 billion, buying it for $44 billion, are really impacting on how democracies play out, on how elections are actually panning out. Like in the country where I am, Philippines, where I am from, we're going to have our elections in less than 2 weeks. And everyone sees how Facebook is actually shaping all these opinions, all the nudging, all the constant nudging are actually impacting and influencing choices and even conditioning of the mind when it comes to analytics, surveys, and all that. So that's the digital world answer to that question. On the physical world, like that we are much more familiar with, like think my co-panelists both mentioned revolving doors. Now we've seen in many countries, developing countries such as mine, and also in big developing countries like Brazil, where you have former executives or current executives of big agricultural and food companies have been appointed as ministers of agriculture, who have become big backers of presidential candidates and politicians. Very obvious in many ways. Like in the Philippines in particular, like executives of banana plantations, which are very powerful in this part of the world because they actually are a big money machine for politicians, are often end up as the secretary or big big officials of our agriculture and food ministries. So that's the short answer. I would have answered that long.
Thank you very much for keeping it short. We're actually running out of time. So I will ask you all to do your final remarks and keep them very short, like half a minute each. And if you would like, you can choose yourself what you would like to highlight here. What we have got requests on is also like what can each one as an individual or as an individual together with others do to change this. So if you would like to ask that, or answer that, or also if you would like to share any positive example or so that we can end with, if you know of any case that has been successful or so, or if you just would like to, something that you would like to the audience to take with them, or just share a reflection from this session. So please, I would like to ask Hector to start. Would you like to do so?
Yeah, thank you. Just very quickly, I think what the idea that I want to leave in the table is the responsibility of the European countries, in the case of El Estor, and the European governments and societies, the responsibility that they have with what's happening in the ground in a country like Guatemala. I mean, all these European-owned companies are doing a lot of damage in the territories. They are their local partners are actually doing a lot of damage. And as Daniel said, the answer to this comes with a lot of political will. So pushing European governments that are housing these corporations or consuming the goods that these corporations produce, pressuring him to actually engage in the solution and acknowledge the kind of damage that they are doing. I think it's of the utmost importance in terms of addressing all the damage and violations to human rights of the local communities in Guatemala and elsewhere in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Net, would you like to continue?
Yeah, to me as well, very short. I know that we could feel helpless and powerless, like seeing all these big figures of how big and how huge money is involved behind these few corporations that dominate very important industries and sectors like food and agriculture. But to me, like as an individual and also as a civil society development worker, like understanding what's behind it, also how this happened and how this continues to happen, makes it more crunchable, makes it more manageable to know how to address and how to challenge this. And us as civil society who are doing research and interrogation on this, it's a responsibility to make this information reachable, accessible to people and communities, for them to be able to understand what kind of actions could matter and make a dent. And there are a number of examples to derive inspirations from, like the strong agroecology movement globally is an inspiration on how a movement has become sort of mainstream in terms of addressing key challenges: environment, biodiversity, and climate change. And also at the national level, we've seen how European NGOs actually could challenge and urge their governments to come up with policies that would address competition, that would address monopoly control, like the movement behind the mobilization around the Bayer Monsanto merger 3-4 years ago in Germany, have actually made some dent in terms of ensuring that competition policies and competition authorities serve public interest, not the interest of corporations.
Thank you, Net. And Danielle, you also have half a minute for final remarks.
So one thing I would like to just mention is that we have to look at the past as well. There's been huge challenges which seemed impossible in the past that we overcame, from slavery to colonialism. And one thing that's common is that these systems were well understood to be unjust within the general public. We understood the problems of the system, and when suddenly change started happening, it grew and spread very quickly. And we need to do that as well. So a lot of people focus on the individual aspects, like using LED lights, low consumption, but this is a system problem. And don't allow corporations to transfer the guilt to our personal actions, because our system is not giving us sustainable options. And therefore we need a system change. And we cannot let them change it, because these small steps, I'm not going to say not doing it, they are important, but they're not the full solution. The solution comes from system change. So the first step sometimes is not actions. There might not be an action you can do. The first step is in the mind. We need to spread the understanding of the problems of the system. Where are the issues? What are the solutions? what is truly sustainable, what is good for the people. And that is important. And because if that mentality spreads and we have a good understanding of what's the false solution, what lies are being told to us, and what is the true narrative, when these opportunities to act come, we'll have mass mobilization. And we never know when that happens. It can suddenly start. It's not linear sometimes. It can be a big explosion of action, but we need to know we have to understand the system and know, so to identify these opportunities to act. And so the mind is very important. Spreading the information, speaking with people, getting a deep understanding, especially, and this information has to come from indigenous local people that have suffered the most from the system, know it's how badly it is, and also because a lot of solutions are coming from there. And we need to understand these things so when opportunities come, we can act. As for more specific examples of its successes, I think a good example for how we deal with corporate capture can come from tobacco. For many years, it was very difficult to get action in Europe, for example, on restricting tobacco, from advertisement to health restrictions to all this. And then they created conditions to prevent lobbies, the influence of lobby. They put conditions of having all transparency in all meetings. Anyone that's in the decision-making process can't go into a tobacco company for 5 years afterwards, and all these restrictions, and it helped. And we can, there's some cases where we've restricted the influence of corporations, and even those small restrictions has given us big gain. So there are small solutions and examples out there of how it can be happened. But the problem is every time we find a solution, the corporations react and adapt to prevent this from happening again. And that's what we have to understand. But at the end of the day, change first comes in the mind, and we have to spread the mentality, the narrative, and then opportunities will come for us to act. But we need to understand and have understanding so we can act in the right moment when these opportunities come. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And they're very strong messages and very nice with a positive example as well that can guide us. So I think we bring with us that we need system change. And I would also like to repeat what Ned said earlier, that we need to understand how corporate capture is manifesting to be able to do something about it. And I think that's what we have been doing in this session, and you have been brilliant, all three panelists, in showing that. So a big thank you to all three of you, Net, Hector, and Danielle. I would also like to say thank you to the audience that have been with us, and also to everyone that has been working for making this possible, including everyone in the Stockholm Plus 50 network, and the technicians that have been doing a great work. And a last also thank you to What Next, and also to IM Sverige, Individuell Människohjälp, since they have contributed and suggested and contributed with contacts to panelists, Hector and Net, respectively. So big thank you for that. And before we end this session, I just want to remind also that there are several activities that will happen in connection or ahead and during Stockholm Plus 50, but that are led by civil society organizations and people movements. So please, you can enter the Network Plus 50 website, that is stockholmplusfifty.se. And there you will find more information about People's Forum, also about manifestations and so on. So I hope that we will see each other in Stockholm or digitally in connection to that. And please also stay if you understand Swedish and you would like to hear more about corporate impunity and binding treaty, and we will start at 8 o'clock. And I will, for the ones downstairs, I will come there soon then for that session. So thanks everyone.
Så hej igen, det var fint att se er publiken som är här. Det känns mycket bättre att se någon prata, tycker jag. Och hej också till publiken där hemma. Fint att ni är tillbaka, ni som är det. Om det är någon som är ny så kanske jag bara ska säga igen att mitt namn är Emelie Muntrakis och jag jobbar på Afrikagrupperna, om det är någon som har tillkommit sen den tidigare delen. Vi har ju nu lyssnat på ett panelsamtal med flera bra, intressanta paneldeltagare. Och fokus på det var just hur företaget tar över. Men jag tror att det också blev tydligt att företag faktiskt bidrar till kränkningar av mänskliga rättigheter och till miljöförstöring. Och det tror jag att de flesta vet om och är överens om, men ändå så är det så himla svårt att komma åt det här problemet. Och det är svårt att ställa företag till svars. Och det här initiativet i FN som är ett bindande, där man vill ta fram ett bindande fördrag för mänskliga rättigheter gentemot företagen då. Det är det handlar om. Jag vet inte hur många er som känner till det initiativet. Du ser ju inte er där hemma. Men ni som är här, kan vi köra lite så här handuppräckning om ni hör talas om det initiativet i FN? Ja, men det är några som gör det. Då pratar jag vidare om det, så får ni hojta till om det är något som känns självklart, eller om det är något annat fokus ni vill ha helt enkelt. Bakgrunden till det här initiativet, som det här initiativet egentligen är svar på, är att samtidigt då som mänskliga rättigheter inte riktigt har ett så starkt skydd. Det finns ju otaliga regler som inte är bindande kring mänskliga rättigheter, men det finns väldigt få då som är bindande. Men samtidigt då som det sker så finns det ju flera tusen olika avtal som skyddar företagens investeringsintressen. Bland annat då i handelsavtal, ofta frihandelsavtal då. Och det kan både vara bilaterala avtal mellan enskilda länder, till exempel säg Sverige och Mozambique. Men det kan också vara genom till exempel frihandelsavtal som EU har med andra länder eller andra regioner. Och det kan också vara mer tematiska avtal kring en viss fråga, som till exempel energi eller så. I dem så finns det i alla fall ofta något som kallas för Investor State Dispute Settlements på engelska. ISDS brukar man förkorta det. Det är helt enkelt till för då att företag ska våga investera i andra länder. Att det blir som en trygghet för dem då, att förutsättningarna för deras investeringar inte förändras. Men de här instrumenten, ISDS-mekanismerna som finns de gör det också möjligt då för företagen att stämma hela länder ifall förutsättningarna för deras investeringar förändras. Och det här leder ju då i sin tur till att det kan bli en konflikt mellan mänskliga rättigheter och indirekt även miljö och företagens intressen. Ett väldigt uppmärksammat exempel där är från Ecuador, där det var en väldigt stor oljeläcka på 90-talet som företaget Chevron Texaco, de bytte namn sen, stod bakom. Och till skillnad från många andra fall faktiskt så organiserade sig, eller det är kanske inte skillnaden, men lokalbefolkningen och många urfolksgrupper då som var drabbade organiserade sig och startade även en rättslig tvist mot det här. Och de vann i alla instanser i Ecuador och skulle få kompensation från företaget och upprättelse då såklart. Men trots det då, eller på grund av de här ISDS-mekanismerna som finns, så blev svaret att Ecuador, eller att Chevron Texaco då istället stämde Ecuador för att det förstörde för deras investeringar. Så det här var lite upprinningen till att det här initiativet sen togs, och då var Ecuador tillsammans med Sydafrika som skrev en resolution 2014 där man ville komma åt det problemet, och just därför så var det transnationella företag som man ville adressera och ha skyddande, eller att ha bindande då regler för att transnationella företag måste respektera mänskliga rättigheter och att
människor då som drabbas ska ha tillgång till ett juridiskt system, kanske en överordnad liksom, global domstol dit man kan vända sig eller så, för att kunna få upprättelse och kompensation. Och tanken var ju då att det här skulle vara liksom globalt och överordnat så att man har någon chans gentemot någon slags motsvarighet då till de här ISDS-mekanismerna. Eller företagens då, skydd. Och efter att den här resolutionen skrevs så bildades det då en arbetsgrupp i FN som fick till uppgift att ta fram ett sånt här fördrag. Och de har kallat in till förhandlingar varje år, och för några år sedan kom också första utkastet och sedan dess har det kommit flera nya. Så i oktober varje år bjuds både länder och civilsamhälle och andra som drabbas in, och så förhandlar man liksom kring det här utkastet. Och sen efter de förhandlingarna kommer det ett nytt utkast och sen blir det nya förhandlingar i oktober nästa år kring det nya utkastet, och så håller det på. Och sådana här processer brukar ju ta lång tid, men det är väldigt utmärkande skulle jag säga att globala syd är väldigt starkt representerat, både civilsamhället men också länder som är väldigt drivande i det. Däremot så är det många länder i nord som inte alls är särskilt engagerade i den här processen utan som snarare kanske försöker motarbeta den. Och både Sverige och EU är inte med och förhandlar och inte liksom ställt sig bakom det här initiativet och stöttar det alltså inte. Istället då så har ju de tagit fram nu på senare tid egna initiativ. Det finns både länder som har tagit initiativ till nationella lagstiftningar där man pratar om att göra HRD, Human Rights Due Diligence, som alltså är en process. Då skulle man ta fram en lagstiftning så att företag måste göra den här processen som handlar om att i förväg utvärdera risker med sin verksamhet och försöka förebygga dem. Och det är ju verkligen jättebra. Vi har ju, det tycker vi också är väldigt positivt såklart, men vi börjar också se risker med de här initiativen. Det senaste i ledet av de här initiativen är att EU vill ta fram ett direktiv som ska gälla för alla EU-länder, så att de företagen som är tillhör liksom europeiska då, eller sådana som de jobbar med, att de ska kunna omfattas av det här och tvingas göra en sån här konsekvensanalys i förväg. Och man pratar ju också då om att det ska ha extraterritoriell verkan, vilket i princip betyder då att även om brottet har skett någon annanstans, låt säga att ett svenskt företag har bidragit till kränkning av mänskliga rättigheter i Namibia, så kan de som har drabbats i Namibia, skulle de i så fall kunna vända sig till svensk domstol och hävda sin rätt där. Och allt det här låter ju jättebra. Nu har dock första förslaget kommit och det är bristfälligt på många sätt. Bland annat så omfattas inte alla företag utan bara de absolut största av det här. Och det finns inte heller... Man har till exempel pratat om inom Binding Treaty, men även många som har pushat för det här initiativet på EU-nivå, att det måste finnas omvänd bevisbörda. Alltså att bevisbördan inte ligger på de som har drabbats att bevisa företagens skuld, utan tvärtom att företagen måste bevisa att de är oskyldiga, vilket skulle vara det skulle ju verkligen underlätta då för de som har drabbats att kunna driva en sån här process. Som det ser ut idag så är det ganska orimligt för någon som har drabbats att faktiskt kunna göra allt det jobb som krävs då för att kunna driva den här och vinna en sån rättsprocess. Ytterligare en aspekt på det med EU-initiativet. EU har ju också öppet kritiserat, om man förkortar det, Binding Treaty då, initiativet, för att dels så menar man att scope, själva omfattningen av det har ju varit just fokuserad på transnationella företag, och anledningen till det är ju att det är svårt att komma åt dem på grund av det skyddet de har i investeringsskyddsavtalen genom handelsavtalen. Och den problematiken är ju inte detsamma med bolag som är nationella och verkar inom landet, för då funkar ju, eller förhoppningsvis i alla fall, det nationella rättsväsendet för det. Så det har varit en stor kritik, och att det borde inkludera alla företag, och där har man gett efter, och utkasten har förändrats. Nu för tiden står det transnational corporations and other business activities till exempel. Så att mycket har ändrats, men trots det så har EU inte valt att liksom gå med och engagera sig aktivt och förhandla i det här. Och man kan ju också tycka, eller min åsikt också, att det är lite märkligt att man kritiserar och lyckas påverka utan att ens vara med i de förhandlingarna som faktiskt är demokratiska, där alla är inbjudna. Så att, en fråga där, det väcker frågor kring om det här initiativet på EU-nivå faktiskt är genuint för att adressera de här problemen, eller om det är ett sätt att avleda från den här FN-processen. Och istället då starta sitt eget initiativ, vilket skulle kunna leda till att initiativ på FN-nivå antingen rinner ut lite i sanden, eller att man kan komma tillbaka och då försöka påverka det genom att visa hur EUs lag ser ut och försöka få till något liknande globalt då. Och där finns det ju då en risk i den här EU-processen, så är även företag blivit tillfrågade liksom, och varit med i den här konsultationsprocessen. Så att apropå samtalet vi hade innan om hur företag tar över liksom, institutioner och även utformningen av lagstiftningar och sådär, så är det här också ett sådant konkret exempel där, trots att det är företagen som bidrar till de här problemen som man försöker adressera, blir de också tillfrågade om hur lagstiftningen som ska försöka motverka det ska utformas. Hänger ni med? Och sen såklart är ju också, även om det skulle bli ett väldigt bra initiativ på EU-nivå, vilket jag såklart hoppas, eller ett bra direktiv, så är ju inte det tillräckligt, eftersom strukturerna för företag ser ut som de gör, och många projekt då som de driver, det är ju många olika företag involverade, och det är inte säkert att alla de har en europeisk koppling till exempel, eller så, även om det skulle vara något som är europeiskt. Och så finns det ju många andra företag också, så att vi måste ju ha globalt bindande regler då, så att det är ju ytterligare en anledning till att stötta och engagera sig just i Binding Treaty på FN-nivå då, UN Binding Treaty kan jag säga. Men sen ytterligare en aspekt är att det här initiativet är taget av länder i syd, som är de som framför allt, även om det här är globala problem som såklart ser liknande ut överallt, så drabbas väldigt många i syd väldigt, väldigt negativt av företags övertramp när de sker. Och civilsamhället är också väldigt starkt där. Sen ska jag också säga att det finns även farhågor med Binding Treaty. Det går också i en riktning där, efter senaste förhandlingarna förra året då, så har man valt att bilda en Friends of the Share heter det, och det är som en liten arbetsgrupp med olika representanter som mellan förhandlingarna då jobbar med den här processen, och i den så verkar det som att även företag ska ingå. Hittills har Binding Treaty-processen liksom inte haft något större liksom inflytande från företag, utan det har varit framförallt länderna som har förhandlat, och även civilsamhället, och liksom, som har då varit de drabbades röst i det hela. Det har också kommit upp diskussioner om huruvida det ska vara ett fördrag och en konvention, och där finns det en del åsikter om att den nyare debatten om att det ska bli en konvention istället för fördrag kan vara ett sätt att försvaga den här processen.
Men oavsett så känns det ju väldigt viktigt då att vara engagerad i den här processen och försöka få den att bli att det här fördraget eller konventionen eller vad det nu blir, att det blir så bra som möjligt. Och det kommer aldrig gå att komma framåt om inte fler länder ställer sig bakom och deltar i förhandlingarna. Så att vi jobbar här i Sverige då med att försöka sätta press på den svenska regeringen att engagera sig i det här. Och när jag säger vi så är vi med Afrikagrupperna tillsammans med FIAN, Latinamerikagrupperna och Jordens vänner är med i något som kallas Treaty Alliance Sverige. Det är alltså ett nätverk som pushar för det här i Sverige. Men Treaty Alliance finns även internationellt och det finns motsvarigheter också som till exempel Treaty Alliance Europe. Så det finns också, det här är en jättestor global rörelse som ändå stöttar det här och det finns även något som heter Global Campaign to Dismantle Corporate Power som också driver det här och där är bland annat flera av Afrikagruppernas partnerorganisationer med och driver det. Och det finns även en grupp som heter Feminists for a Binding Treaty som också är starka förespråkare men som pushar lite extra för att få in feministiska perspektiv i det i och med att människor drabbas olika av företagsövertramp och kvinnor ofta är mer sårbara. Jag tänker att jag stoppar där. Jag har pratat på väldigt länge nu känner jag. Och så öppnar jag upp för frågor istället. Eller kommentarer. Eller om ni vill lägga till något. Eller reflektioner eller så. Jag vet inte om jag såg dig räcka upp en hand. Kanske Boel?
Jag tänkte om du skulle tydliga skillnaden på...
Ja, det var en jättesvår fråga och jättesnårig. Jag är själv inte jurist och jag har frågat runt om det. Ja, frågan var skillnaden mellan fördrag och konvention. Jag sa att jag tycker att det är en jättesvår fråga som jag har försökt förstå vad skillnaden egentligen är. Och jag har fått olika svar från olika jurister också om hur viktigt det egentligen är. Så att jag har tyvärr inte jättebra svar men jag har förstått att det finns det är en forskare som på senare tid har pratat om att det skulle vara lättare att få igenom det ifall det blev en konvention istället. Och det har ju välkomnats av många liksom, i och med att man har sett det som en öppning men då har det kommit någon motreaktion också om att det skulle bli svagare och jag tror att det handlar om huruvida det implementeras om det implementeras hur det implementeras i respektive land då, som omfattas av det. Men mer än så vågar jag inte säga. Det kanske finns något bra svar från någon i publiken, tänker jag. Det har vi kanske där, så jag lämnar över till dig. Som jag inte vet vad du heter, för gärna säga vad du heter också.
Ja, heter jag. Jag har ställt den här frågan ganska.
Jag kanske kan repetera efter varje mening då. Vi har Jan Lönn i publiken som har följt den här frågan väldigt länge.
Till och med efter Stockholmskonferensen att det skapades inom FN på förslag av länderna en kommitté inom FN som hette Kommissionen kring transnationella företag. Den skapades 1974, började arbeta 75 och just med syfte att man skulle förhandla fram en uppförandekod rörande transnationella företag. Men då var det ju bredare, då var det inte bara om transnationella företag och mänskliga rättigheter. Men den arbetade ju, USA gjorde ju särskilt motstånd, andra länder också. Och 1992, precis när sista förberedelsemötet hölls inför Rio-konferensen om miljö och utveckling, då så lyckades pressen från USA och kompani få FNs generalsekreterare att stänga ner sekretariatsenheten, som var en stor sekretariatsenhet som kallas för Center kring transnationella företag som bistod länderna i syd när det gällde förhandlingar och så vidare kring transnationella företag, hur man skulle ha relationer med dem. Och sen då så stängdes kommissionen ner, den som var en kommission under det ekonomiska och sociala rådet. Den stängdes ner då 1994. Så upphörde allting av den här, eller inte allting eftersom en del flyttades över till andra enheter. Men så var början på det. Och sen kom då Global Compact då, som var ett slags försök att uppställa några moralregler för storföretagen då i början av 2000-talet. Och sen så har vi ju då det som kom och blev antaget av FNs mänskliga rättighetsråd 2011. Och det är väldigt viktigt, för det spelar en stor roll i de här förhandlingarna kring binding legal instruments. Och det är då den UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Och den antogs då enhälligt av MR-rådet, men på förslag av en amerikansk professor som hade anlitats för det här. Så den här Guiding Principles on Human Rights and Businesses, det är det som EU-länderna och kompani säger, det är det som är universellt tillämpligt. Vi behöver ingenting mer än detta. Och det spelar en väldigt stor roll i de här förhandlingarna att understryka att vi behöver egentligen inte, vad är det här, behövs det här verkligen? Och sen de som inte är anhängare till det, ja, de säger det att ja, kan vi inte vänta och se, vi är inte övertygade. Och så får man ständigt i de här nya utkasten, det finns ju, jag tror att det är 3 stycken utkast som det har kommit till förhandling för den här konventionen eller vad det nu kommer att handlas om då. Ja.
Tack Jan, och tack för bakgrunden också med UNGP. Det är ju en av alla de här frivilliga riktlinjerna som finns idag. Och den är ju väldigt, väldigt bra. Problemet är ju bara det att den är frivillig, och det är ju det, ja, men som du säger, som är anledningen till att man vill ta fram ett sånt bindande regelverk då. Så att, som egentligen skulle kunna vara i princip som UNGP, fast bindande. Tack för det inlägget. Är det några fler frågor eller kommentarer eller så? Jag tror inte att jag kan se om det kommer något från er som är mer digitalt. Om det går att lösa vore det toppen om de skulle kunna komma upp på skärmen. Är det någon mer fråga här från publiken? Det verkar inte så. Fantastiskt. Och så stressade ni innan över att det var så svårt att hålla tiden. Så det känns jättebra. Nu har vi någon kommentar där.
Det finns en fråga om ni kan länka till organisationerna som jobbar mot företagsöverfall och kontroll. Kan du lägga in det i eventet?
Ja, jag vet inte om alla har hört din fråga. Det var en fråga om huruvida vi skulle kunna länka till organisationer som jobbar med de här frågorna. Jag tänker att det är jättemånga organisationer som jobbar med de här frågorna. Vi kan lägga till det eventet, så har vi också. Men jag tänker spontant att om inte annat så kan vi lägga upp de som är med i Treaty Alliance Sverige som driver just den här frågan. Sen finns det ju många fler som jobbar generellt sett mot företags kränkningar av mänskliga rättigheter och miljöförstöring och så. Jättebra inlägg och superbra att vi blir påminna om att sätta upp det. Då tänker jag att vi avslutar den här sessionen, så får jag tacka så jättemycket för alla som har varit med hela kvällen.